Yeah, AI for social good. What does it even mean? Hopefully, every application of AI is going to be good for society. Unfortunately, not the case. And then there are applications that would be really important for society, really useful, but it's not happening because they might not be profitable for industry. And that's one of the main themes of my presentation today. That means governments have a responsibility there to get this ecosystem of AI applications off the ground and to fund, directly or indirectly these efforts so that we benefit maximally from these technologies. And of course, they also have a role in protecting the public from the not so socially good applications or the carelessness that may happen in the IT industry. Right now, there's basically no rules. If you compare with industries like airlines or transportations, they're heavily regulated, and basically that's not yet the case for IT in general and AI in particular. Okay, I've been doing machine learning research for many decades. I started in 1985, roughly. And for a number of these decades, until the beginning of the teens of this century, this research was essentially happening just in universities, writing papers, developing new algorithms, new theories, and so on. But what happened in the last 10 years is that has transitioned into industry because these methods work and they can, have a great value for society, and many companies are still we're still in the beginning of taking advantage of that in terms of the economic value. However, that means researchers and others, the engineers that are working on these products, the entrepreneurs that are thinking, where these methods could be used, and governments that are regulating and funding some of these efforts, we all have a responsibility to think about the social impact of these technologies, both on the positive side and the negative side. Okay, pretty obvious things, what I'm saying, but it's worth saying, because some people think governments just stay out of it. So now let me go a little bit on the dark side. Well, humans have always been building tools, and those tools, of course, have given us a lot of the prosperity that we know and health that we have, and so on. But tools can also become weapons. They can also become instruments of power, and can hurt democracy and all these things. So part of the role of governments is precisely to make sure those tools are used in ways that are aligned with the needs of society. But there is something more challenging here, is that what governments do really is put in law and in action sort of the general wisdom about how we should deal with those tools. The problem is, it's not always clear, what's right and wrong with the use of those tools, and there's like an apprentice sorcerer issue, that we may be developing tools that we don't even yet understand, and the consequences of these could be terrible. Or if they end up in the hands of people that have bad intentions, and these people exist, what could happen? So long as the tools we were building were kind of weak, I mean, in the worst case, A knife can kill a few people, but not the whole, species. But a nuclear bomb can kill a lot of people, and a nuclear winter could, put an end to humanity. Similarly, as AI tools become more powerful, I think we need to worry about how they could have global impacts. For example, in the military, but other sort of more subtle ways that could be really damaging, or even in the case of the fears regarding super intelligent AI that could go wrong or be misused, endanger our species, or at least endanger our civilization. Okay, so these are big questions, and the problem I see is our abilities to deal with these hard questions, not just at the technological level, but in terms of our collective wisdom, our political wisdom, unfortunately, is not sufficient. It's like technology is moving faster than our individual and collective wisdom are progressing, and that's dangerous. And that's what keeps me, sometimes not sleeping at night. And I don't have like a magical solution to this, but that's the background. Now I'm going to go to like more mundane questions for the rest of the talk. Yeah, so because we were starting to worry about these things, a group of scholars in Montreal, but this has been going on around the planet, have been trying to clarify what is it we're where's the line between right and wrong? What do we want? What do we need? What do we not want from these AI tools that are being developed and that will be developed in the coming years and decades? So the Montreal Declaration was one of the first of these declarations. It's meant to be addressing the questions at a global level, and it's articulated around 10 principles that you see here. So of course, like the most important is like the well-being principle. We want tools that are going to help the well-being of humans. And you can see already that like some weapons could potentially not fall in that category. But there are more subtle things like autonomy of people, privacy, solidarity, democracy, equity, sustainable development, and so on, right? And we know that there are issues around all of those points. And then so there's this declaration that covers those in detail. So let's have a quick highlight of the bad things that can happen. I'm sure some of you already heard about this. This conference is a lot about these kinds of questions. So I already mentioned the military. There is, the fear that we had a few years ago when I and many others signed letters to governments asking them to ban lethal autonomous weapons, also known as killer robots. The fear, is becoming a reality. So we've seen evidence of one of these drones equipped with that can kill, a particular person. We've seen that these are in action and they're controlled by computer vision system with AI. So unfortunately, the military around the world are developing these things, and it's endangering the security of all of us and the military stability that we've enjoyed in the last few decades. There is also the issue of how these tools based on face recognition could be controlled by authoritarian governments in order to monitor and punish and control their population. So if the authoritarian governments, of the 30s and 40s and 50s in the world that I don't need to name, had the tools that we currently have, it might have been more difficult for democracy to make the progress it has made later on. There are lots of other issues that people have raised. One of those I think deserves more attention is how AI could be used to control people just through surveillance in particular ways, to vote in particular ways, to absorb false information as if it was true. And we're seeing this a lot these days around vaccination, for example. So these are really serious issues where AI could become an important tool for bad. There's been a lot of discussion about how these tools could incorporate social biases and help discrimination instead of the other way around. They can also have an impact on the structure of our society. Automation creates lots of jobless people and misery if we're not careful about how we're going to handle that, and governments have a role there. They can increase inequality and power concentration, whether it's in the hands of a few people, companies, or countries, and we are seeing that happening. So these are just little things, right? You have to worry about. And going back to my theme about this rare in women and increasing in the past, one general sort of analogy that I like to think of is, if everyone on Earth could just press a button and throw off major nuclear weapons, what would be the outcome? And how do we reduce the probability of such things happening? And so I think here we have to basically consider how we need everyone on Earth to be well fed, well educated, healthy, and feel like positive about humanity, about their society, and so on, because it's the crazy people or the angry people who are going to really be the most dangerous as we develop those tools. Now let's move on a slightly more positive side of the coin regarding the AI for social good applications, the beneficial AI potential that is growing very quickly across many applications. I've been involved in most of these medical applications, environmental applications, educational applications, democratizing justice, humanitarian applications. So I'm gonna talk about some projects that I've been involved in or that are going on, just to highlight what this means. But it's a growing movement, and then the last part of my talk will be about what governments can and should do to make that happen more and better. So on the environmental side, it's clear that the climate change challenge is the most pressing challenge for humanity in many ways. At least the risk is very high of some really bad things happening. And even if we just go for the mean, like the expected trajectory of climate that we're going into, the losses to humanity, both economic and human, are terrible. So many researchers in AI have been asking themselves, like, what can I do? And we came up with a certain number of areas where AI could be used for doing a little bit. Like, I don't think anyone has found like a killer app on the climate change front. It's going to be a lot of different areas or different sectors where AI could be used, but it is part of a much larger toolbox and political efforts in order to achieve the required changes. So there's been quite a bit of research on, for example, optimizing energy resources, because machine learning can be used to make predictions, like predict demand, predict the availability of renewable resources like sunlight, optimize electrical grids, optimize the use of energy in transportation, and so on. That there's a lot of things there. Then there's work that's going on that's more directly linked to the climate science, so helping to construct better climate models. Again, you can think of it as like a prediction problem, but it's much more complex in the sense that we want to incorporate scientific knowledge about climate as well as data. And that's really interesting from a research point of view, and can really help us predict better the outcome of different strategies we may have to mitigate climate change. One area I'm working on these days, and still in its infancy, is the use of AI in the development of new materials, because these materials could be used, for example, for carbon capture and things like that, or batteries. There's been already quite a bit of work also on the biodiversity side and conservation efforts. We can use machine learning to analyze satellite images, train them to detect particular things in those images, and that can be extremely useful. And then finally, something a little bit out of the usual menu of applications of AI, I'll tell you about a project that's more political in the sense. That's more about how we can use machine learning to help us be more rational in our decisions about climate change, by helping people to integrate in a more visceral way the information through the generation of images. So visualizing the future impact of climate change to increase our empathy, or the emotional importance that we give to this issue. All right. One thing I want to mention, so in the Montreal Declaration, we had a part about sustainable development. And one of the questions that had been discussed quite a bit in the last couple of years is, is the use of AI, just from the point of view of computing with large computing resources that spend a lot of energy, isn't that actually hurting climate change? And there are a number of studies that have been made. My take-home message is the use that is made of, for example, GPUs, these specialized processors that people use a lot for deep learning, in academia is still like a tiny drop in the bucket in terms of energy resources. But on the other hand, the large server farms, for example, that are used by companies like Google and Microsoft and Amazon, so on, and Facebook, they are quite significant. And in order to encourage developers to write code that's going to lead to more efficient use of energy resources, we wrote a software called Code Carbon, which you can go and see, that makes it very easy for people who write Python code to wrap their code around something that will measure the GPU usage and then convert that to CO2 equivalent, depending on where you are on Earth, which, on which electrical grid, what's the mix of renewable and fossil fuels and so on, in order to estimate the carbon footprint. Okay, so now let me tell you a little bit about the visualization project. So the real problem, I think, in terms of doing the right thing with climate change, is, even though we know rationally what we should do, like we have all of the science that's very clear, the majority of people, and thus of governments, don't do enough, It's like we underestimate the threat. Why is that? Well, it's really a psychological issue. I mean, there are other issues, obviously. There are lobbies and so on, but I think the main problem isn't that. The main problem is just irrational behavior. So why are we irrational about this? Basically, out of sight, out of mind. We don't see it in our immediate surroundings that there is a threat. Evolution has shaped our brain so that we would respond with high emotions to immediate threats, like a bear running after us or something like that. But the problem with climate change is it's changes that are going to happen over decades, and the big catastrophes that we see actually right now already, they're typically happening somewhere else. So the actual number of places where it's happening is a tiny fraction. So 99% of humans don't feel it in their body, right? So what can we do? Well, there are studies that suggest that visualization helps to anchor emotionally the things that we know rationally, but we don't pay enough attention to. So we decided to create a website that is now online. It was put online, I think, just last week. It's called This Climate Does Not Exist. And what it does is it allows to visualize how different places on Earth could look like if they were flooded, or they were in an area with forest fires, or with smog, which can be a consequence in cities, for example. So yeah, you're welcome to go, and basically you can type your address. If Google Street View knows about your address, then you can turn the images from Street View into one of these three settings. And we're using conditional GANs, which happens to be something that came out of my group a few years ago, to synthesize these images. So there are obviously images that don't exist. In particular, for example, my home is elevated. It's on a hill, and it's never going to be flooded. But the point is not to predict what's going to happen, because we don't have, climate science doesn't allow us to do that, but rather to use this as a empathy tool, to make that reality more tangible by showing your house, that's familiar to you, how it would look like if it was, flooded, for example. So we want to make it more personal so that people kind of integrate the danger in a visceral way. So let me show you what this tool can do. So this is not a real flooding. This came from a picture of a house that was in a normal state. And you can see it's not perfect. The tool has put water in a way that's not quite right, but it's pretty impressive. You can see how the lighting on the water takes into account the actual context and illumination and so on. Here's another example. So this is all synthetic. It starts from an image where you see the building, and then it transforms it. This is actually a street in Montreal. And this is the smog. And this is the effect of being in an area where there are fires. If you've been in one of these areas, like in California or Australia, you might remember things like this. Okay, so now I want to turn to governments, right? So how could governments stimulate AI-based innovation for long-term public good? And I say innovation here in the meaning of building products, right? In new products. So academia is already working on AI for social good, and we could increase the funding for that, and we should. But the big gap that exists right now is in industry. There is no industry that is looking at these applications because they might not be sufficiently attractive from a profit perspective, especially if we're looking at long-term outcomes. So one of the themes I want to talk about in this respect is the role of data. As you know, AI systems need data. Modern AI systems really built on machine learning. Machine learning builds the intelligence by extracting information from large data sets. Problem is these data sets are not always publicly available. And that happens, I'll come back, in industry, where a lot of data sets are constructed but not shared. Unfortunately, that's going to slow down the progress of science. So one way to think about this is knowledge and data, which is a special kind of knowledge, are really public goods. And our society currently is not organized to take that into account. So what is a public good? It's like, the air we breathe, or the roads we share. It's usually governments that are managing these public goods because the tragedy of the commons would otherwise ensue if it was just private agents like companies that are just maximizing their individual interests. So there's the question of how can we change our society to increase substantially the sharing of data and knowledge. That's going to be important for AI. And one example of this is in healthcare and drug discovery, because currently drug discovery is something that's happening in large part in pharma industry or biotechs, and they tend to keep their data very closely to them and not share them. One example that I like to use to illustrate the need for government intervention is antimicrobial resistance. So it's actually something I'm working on. The problem is we've been using antibiotics to kill dangerous bacteria that were a plague in the general sense and in a particular sense for centuries and thousands of years. Since the 50s, we've had these drugs, but we kind of overused them, and now evolution has done its work. And these bacteria, but actually the same thing is happening with fungus and viruses. These bacteria have evolved to be resistant to the drugs we're currently using. So this is antimicrobial resistance. That's the problem. And the number of people dying because we don't have the drug to kill the bug that is invading their body, the number of people dying is quickly increasing. So right now it's on the order of a bit less than 1 million per year, and it's going to rise to about 10 million per year by 2050 if nothing is done. And that's a lot of deaths. That's compared to the COVID-19 pandemic. This is per year, not just a couple of years, but every year on and on. And that would put our healthcare systems to its knees, because these antibiotics are used everywhere in like surgical operations, fighting cancer, and lots of things. Even your dentist uses them. So there is not only human cost, but also economic cost, a huge economic cost. Like we're talking about $100 trillion by 2050. And the funny thing is, industry is not doing much, almost zero, to deal with this. In other words, pharma are not working on developing new antibiotics or antimicrobials in general, because it's not profitable. Even though it would be very profitable for society to have those drugs, for complicated reasons, it's not profitable for industry. Basically, these drugs are sold for cheap, and in particular, if new antibiotics were discovered, they would be used mostly as a last resort tool for people who develop a disease due to an infectious agent that is not responding to current treatments. And so just the amount of sales would not be sufficient. So this is a big thing, and it is possible to use AI to really improve the search in the space of molecules to deal with that, to accelerate, to find better drugs, maybe more targeted ones, because there's an issue also that these antibiotics destroy our biome. So there are lots of ways in which this can be useful, but it takes money to do that research, not just the academic one, but the very expensive development in industry. Just to give you an idea, a typical drug costs about $1 billion to develop. So it's not like little change, but we need it. So the bottom line is, in this really globally important example, there's a mismatch between the commercial value perceived and real value that companies can see in doing the required work, the innovation that's needed, and the societal value. Something needs to change. Like the current economic system is not working. There's what's called a market failure here. And I gave the example of antibiotics, but you have similar issues in the realm of developing new materials to fight climate change. Right now, given the price of carbon, it may not be profitable to do the research that's needed to discover these things. And so again, we need governments to fill the gap. So what should they do, right? So there is a mismatch between the societal value of some innovations and the commercial value. It's like a tragedy of the commons problem. So we need to collectively find solutions to this. And the simple solution is basically governments understand that they're going to basically save a lot of money if they do that. And they need to just get out of this mantra that innovation is something that must happen in industry and that governments have nothing to do with, which is a completely wrong impression. Now, how should they invest? Let's say they decide that they need to invest. In the past, many governments in many countries have funded R&D happening in industry, partially, right? So, for example, grants where the company gives half of the money and the government gives half of the money. And there are several issues with that. So one issue is that, well, if it's not profitable for companies, dividing the cost by 2 may not be sufficient to motivate them. But also giving them a grant, I don't think is going to be an efficient use of government resources. And that is because, well, they could just take the money and do something with it, which is not really what society needs, because they are motivated by profit. So what we need is to mimic what really makes them do a good job, I think, and that is reward companies not just by giving them these grants, but part of the money comes later if what they do turns out to work. So just like what happens with their normal projects in the form of profits, if they develop a product and the product is sold a lot, they make money. So that's the kind of motivation they're used to that we know works. So we need outcome-driven downstream rewards, which is not mostly what governments are currently doing, but some governments are already thinking about this. Things like social impact bonds is an example. Okay, so let's go back to the question of knowledge and data in innovation. So here's a sort of theoretical point of view. Knowledge grows exponentially, like compound interest. And the reason is, when we do research or innovation, that also works, we're of course, we're discovering new things, new ideas, validating ideas and so on, but it's building on all of the available knowledge and data. If each of us had to like rediscover everything from scratch, it just wouldn't work. And so anytime we put barriers to the free movement of knowledge and data, in the case of AI, we are slowing down the progress of science and technology. And of course, the reason why we have these barriers is that sharing what you have discovered in a company goes against the need to compete that companies have for their survival. Like if they spend $100 million on acquiring some data, and then their competitors have access to it for free, you can see that the company doing the work is going to lose on the company just exploiting it. So it's because of the structure of our economic system that we have these barriers right now. So what can we do? Ideally, we completely change the economic system, but short of that, there are things we can do in specific areas, like I mentioned, drug discovery, to change both the culture and the incentive system, so that knowledge and data would be circulating more easily, and thus accelerate the rate of progress and innovation, especially in areas that matter to society. Like, we really need to innovate in order to reduce the costs of mitigating climate change, and we really need to innovate in order to reduce our health costs and make the rest, everybody in the world in a better health state. So this is something society absolutely needs. And how do we make that happen more efficiently, faster, and so on? So I have, let's see, I have three, I think I left, sorry, I thought I had a slide on transparency, but anyways, oh, here it is actually. So here are 3 points, 3 recommendations that I think are worth thinking about. The number one is transparency. So transparency is an interesting thing. It actually helps both ways. It helps to prevent the nefarious uses of AI. So what I mean by this is, imagine that we had legislation that require software that's used, that could have a large social impact, let's say like Facebook software, to be accessible to the public, maybe not necessarily completely like readable by anyone, but anyone with the right credentials or representatives of the public, of the government, and so on. So this would have the effect that we could see what could go wrong, okay, and then potentially steer companies in directions that avoid these problems. But the same thing is true in terms of transparency of the data generated when we're building products, like discovering new drugs. If we forced companies to share that information, through regulation, that would accelerate the progress of science. But of course, how do we do that in a way that companies don't lose interest in producing that data in the first place? And that's not an easy proposition in our current economic system, but I think there are things that can be done. So point 3 basically is related to that. So point 3 here is, in terms of the insights, the data that companies produce as part of their innovation process, It's going to be difficult to force them to share all of it, but when the funding or part of it comes from governments, which would be the case, as I was arguing, for AI for social goods innovation, if governments is giving money, then they could put in their contracts without even changing the laws. They can just change their contracts. They can change their contracts to say, well, okay, so we're going to fund part of your efforts because we need those products, those drugs, or those materials. But it's going to come with strings attached and even rewards to share your data, your tech reports, and so on. So the idea is to move, at least in those areas that have public value, where governments is helping to move the culture, the rules of the game, the contractual structures towards greater open science and open data. So that's requiring point 2 here, which is that government should provide funding for socially beneficial AI. But what this recommendation is also saying is we have to be careful how we do that. Maybe the typical ways that they have been doing it are not the best way to do it. So grants are good, but because they pay for the actual costs. But I think having downstream performance-based payments is going to make a whole difference to the success of such procurement. So you can think of this as innovation procurement. So what does society need that we don't have the instruments in academia or in government research centers to do? Can we stimulate that work in industry? How do we do it? Yeah, that's the discussion. And I'm going to finish with these 2 quotes. Moshe Vardi, somebody that has a lot of interesting insights about technology and science and AI and society, wrote, "Innovation is not a goal, it is a means for societal progress." So there's a bit of the thinking sometimes in some circles that innovation is good in itself, but of course not, right? As I've been arguing today, and many people have, innovation could be misused, and in addition, or it could be just neutral, right? It doesn't really help society. So we really have to organize the social and economic incentives so that innovation is targeted more clearly towards what's good for society. And finally, in line with the recommendations I provided, Benjamin Applebaum in the New York Times wrote, "Instead of redefining the role of the corporation, we need to redefine the role of the state." So what does that mean? Well, there are people who are trying to change the value system of corporations. And I think it's great, but I don't think it's going to be sufficient. So in other words, all these ESG practices to change what it is that corporations are optimizing and measuring, it's great, but I really don't think it's sufficient, because corporations just it's just evolutionary pressure. They compete with other corporations, and if one corporation is more evil, it's going to make more money, especially if it can do it without people noticing. So we can't just rely on goodwill. Goodwill is going to be super important, but goodwill in industry is not going to be sufficient. The state needs to take its responsibilities, which is the main message of my presentation. And as I said, it can take that responsibility by doing some of those innovations, by funding it in the right way so that it happens in corporations, and of course, in academia. But that means a lot of the responsibility is on the state. I mean, the companies are just trying to survive. If we want them to survive while doing good, we need to change the rules of the game, and that is the responsibility of the state. So that's it. Thanks very much for your attention.